I walked into my boyfriend's parents' mansion wearing the simplest dress I owned. They looked at me like I didn't belong there, like I was just a poor, naive girl who could never fit into their rich world. So I decided to play along. I smiled, stayed quiet, and let them underestimate me the entire night. But what they didn't know was that by the end of that dinner, the same girl they were mocking would reveal something that would leave the whole table completely speechless.
Hello, everyone!
I'm Emily, and today I'm going to share a story that will completely shock you. So sit back, relax, and let's get right into it. When Daniel told me his parents wanted to meet me, I noticed the hesitation in his voice. It wasn't the kind of excitement most people feel when they introduce someone they love to their family. Instead, it sounded like worry. He paused for a moment before finishing the sentence, as if he was carefully choosing the right words. "They're a little traditional," he said quietly, "very wealthy, and sometimes they can be a bit judgmental." I smiled when he said that and assured him that everything would be fine. On the outside, I looked calm and relaxed, but inside my mind was already working. I had heard many stories about families like his, powerful, proud, and obsessed with status. People like that often judge others before they even know them. I didn't say anything about it to Daniel because I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable. Instead, I simply nodded and told him I was looking forward to meeting them. Daniel and I had been dating for about 8 months, and during that time he had only seen one version of me. In his eyes, I was just a normal girl with a modest life. I worked a simple administrative job, lived in a small apartment, and never talked about anything related to money or family wealth. I dressed simply when we went out, never wore expensive jewelry, and avoided conversations about business or investments. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. I had learned a long time ago that people behave very differently depending on what they think you have or don't have. Sometimes the easiest way to understand someone's real character is to let them believe you have nothing. The dinner invitation came a few days later. Daniel told me his parents wanted us to come to their house for a formal dinner that weekend. I could hear the tension in his voice again, and it made me curious. Clearly, this meeting meant a lot to him, but it also worried him. That made me wonder what kind of people his parents really were. Instead of feeling nervous, I started thinking of the situation as a small experiment. I wanted to see how they would treat someone they believed was beneath their social level. The idea formed quickly in my mind. I would keep the same image Daniel already knew: a quiet, simple girl who didn't know much about the world of wealth and influence. On the evening of the dinner, I chose my outfit carefully. I could have worn designer clothes if I wanted to, but instead I picked a plain dress that looked nice but completely ordinary. My shoes were simple and slightly worn, the kind most people wouldn't even notice. I kept my makeup minimal, just a little mascara and lip balm. I didn't wear any jewelry at all. When I looked in the mirror before leaving my apartment, I almost laughed. I looked exactly like the kind of girl many rich families assume is unimportant. It was perfect. Daniel picked me up a little before sunset. During the drive, he kept glancing at me, probably wondering if I was nervous. I just smiled and asked him simple questions about his parents. He explained that his father owned a successful company and that his mother was very involved in charity events and social gatherings. They lived in a large house outside the city, in a neighborhood known for its expensive properties. As he talked, I could hear the pride in his voice, but also a small hint of pressure. It sounded like he had spent most of his life trying to live up to their expectations. When we finally arrived, I understood what he meant. The house wasn't just large, it was enormous. The long driveway curved through a perfectly maintained garden with tall trees and bright flowers on both sides. Expensive cars were parked neatly near the entrance. The building itself looked more like a private resort than a family home. Huge windows reflected the evening light, and soft golden lamps illuminated the front steps. I stepped out of the car slowly, pretending to be a little overwhelmed by the size of the place. In reality, I was just observing everything carefully. Daniel led me to the front door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, a housekeeper opened it and welcomed us inside. The moment I walked in, I noticed the marble floors shining under the chandelier above us. Paintings hung on the walls, each one placed perfectly under soft lights. Everything in the house seemed expensive, polished, and carefully chosen to show status. I could almost feel the atmosphere of pride in every corner of the room. Then his parents appeared. His mother walked toward us first. She was elegant, wearing a perfectly tailored dress and expensive jewelry that sparkled under the lights. Her expression looked polite at first, but the moment her eyes landed on me, something changed. She quickly looked me up and down, starting from my shoes and ending at my face. It was the kind of glance people give when they are silently judging every detail. "Daniel," she said slowly, her tone controlled but clearly surprised. "This is your girlfriend." I smiled warmly and offered my hand. She shook it lightly, but her grip was distant, almost careful, as if she wasn't sure what to think of me. A moment later, Daniel's father approached us. He was tall, serious, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to being respected. When Daniel introduced me, he gave a short nod and shook my hand briefly. His expression remained neutral, but I could see the same quick evaluation in his eyes. They didn't say anything rude, but the message was clear. They were already forming their opinion about me. Daniel didn't seem to notice the tension at first. He smiled and started talking about how we met, while his parents listened politely. I stood there quietly, nodding and smiling at the right moments. The act had already begun, and they were starting to believe it. To them, I probably looked like a shy girl who had never been inside a house like this before. Someone simple, maybe even naive. Exactly the image I wanted them to see. As we walked toward the dining room, I could already sense the silent assumptions forming in their minds, the quiet judgments they hadn't spoken yet, but were clearly thinking, and I knew that by the time the night was over, those assumptions would lead them to reveal far more about themselves than they ever intended to show. We walked into the dining room together, and the first thing I noticed was the table. It was long enough to seat at least 10 people. Yet tonight there were only 4 chairs prepared. The surface of the table shined under the soft light from another chandelier above us. Each place setting had several forks, knives, and spoons arranged perfectly beside the plates. Crystal glasses reflected the light like tiny mirrors. Everything looked expensive and carefully organized. The kind of setting designed to impress guests and quietly remind them where they stood in the social hierarchy. I followed Daniel and sat down, trying to appear slightly unsure about where to place my hands. Margaret watched me closely while we settled into our chairs. Her polite smile hadn't disappeared, but her eyes kept studying me. I could almost feel the silent questions running through her mind. Daniel's father sat at the head of the table, his posture straight and confident, like someone who was used to controlling the room. A housekeeper appeared a moment later and began serving the first course. The smell of the food was wonderful, but the tension in the air made the room feel strangely cold. Margaret broke the silence first. "So," she said gently while lifting her glass of water, "Daniel has told us very little about you." Her voice sounded sweet, but there was a careful curiosity behind it. "Where did you study?" I paused for a second before answering, lowering my eyes slightly as if I was shy. "Oh, just a small college," I replied softly. She tilted her head a little. "Which one?" I gave a small nervous laugh and shrugged. "Nothing fancy," I said. It was close to home. The answer clearly disappointed her. I could see the quick glance she exchanged with her husband. They didn't say anything out loud, but the look between them said enough. To them, education was probably something prestigious. Famous universities, elite degrees, connections that could open doors in powerful circles. My vague answer suggested the opposite. I picked up my fork carefully, pretending to focus on the food while they silently processed what they believed they had just learned about me. Daniel tried to keep the conversation relaxed. He talked about a recent trip he had taken for work and asked his father about the company. His father explained some business deal they were working on, using complicated terms about investments and negotiations. I listened quietly, occasionally nodding as if I didn't fully understand the details. In reality, I understood every word. But tonight wasn't about showing what I knew. It was about watching how they behaved when they believed I didn't know anything at all. A few minutes later, Margaret asked another question. "And what about your family?" she said while cutting a piece of her food. "What do your parents do?" I kept my tone calm and simple. "My mom runs a little shop," I answered. That statement was technically true, but it was only a tiny piece of the story. I deliberately left out every other detail. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly, and her husband leaned back in his chair. Again, they exchanged a quick look that lasted only a second, but it carried a quiet judgment. In their world, a small shop probably sounded insignificant, something modest, ordinary, maybe even disappointing for a family like theirs. Daniel shifted in his seat. I could see that he was beginning to feel uncomfortable. He probably noticed the subtle reactions his parents were having, but didn't know how to stop them without creating an argument. I kept smiling politely, as if none of it bothered me. The next course was served, and the table briefly became quiet again. I looked at the different forks and knives beside my plate and purposely picked one with a little hesitation. It was a small detail, but Margaret noticed immediately. Her eyes followed my hands carefully, almost like she was confirming another assumption about me. Then she asked another question. "Have you ever attended a charity gala?" she said casually. I looked at her with a slightly confused expression, tilting my head like I wasn't completely sure what she meant. "A gala," I repeated. "Oh no, I don't think so. They're usually fundraising events," she explained with a polite smile. "Very elegant gatherings." "Oh," I said softly, nodding slowly as if I had just learned something new. "No, I've never been to one of those. They sound expensive." Her smile tightened just a little after that answer. The reaction was small, but it was there. Each question she asked seemed designed to measure where I belonged in their world, and every answer I gave pushed me further away from their expectations. The more naive I appeared, the more certain they became that I was not someone who belonged in their social circle. Daniel tried to change the topic again by asking me about my job. I described it simply, explaining that I worked in an office doing administrative tasks. I avoided mentioning anything related to business decisions or investments. Margaret nodded slowly while listening, but her expression had changed slightly. The polite curiosity from earlier was fading, replaced by something more confident. It was the expression people wear when they think they have already figured someone out. The interesting part was watching how their behavior slowly shifted as the dinner continued. At the beginning, they had been cautious, trying to learn more about me. But as my answers painted a picture of a quiet, ordinary life, Their curiosity turned into quiet certainty. They believed they understood exactly who I was. Daniel's father began speaking more openly about business again, but this time he didn't include me in the conversation. He spoke mainly to Daniel, discussing future plans for the company and the responsibilities Daniel might take on one day. I listened silently while cutting my food, occasionally smiling as if the conversation was far beyond my understanding. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair and studied me again. There was less effort in her politeness now. She had already made her judgment, and it seemed clear in the way she looked at me. To her, I was probably a nice girl, but not someone who belonged in a powerful family like theirs. I lowered my eyes politely, pretending not to notice. Inside, however, I was carefully observing every reaction, every expression, every small signal they revealed without realizing it. The experiment was working perfectly. With each passing minute, they became more comfortable with their assumptions, more confident that they knew exactly what kind of person was sitting across from them at their dinner table, and they had no idea that the quiet girl they were studying so closely understood their world far better than they could possibly imagine. As the dinner continued, the atmosphere in the room slowly began to change. At first, the conversation had been polite and careful, like everyone was trying to maintain good manners. But the longer the evening went on, the more relaxed Daniel's parents seemed to become. Unfortunately, their version of relaxed meant they were no longer trying very hard to hide what they really thought about me. Margaret placed her fork gently on her plate and leaned back in her chair. Her expression looked calm, but there was a new confidence in the way she looked at me. It was the look of someone who believed they had already figured everything out. Daniel's father sat quietly for a moment, sipping his drink while listening to the conversation. I kept my posture polite and my voice soft whenever I spoke, continuing the same simple, slightly shy personality I had shown since arriving. Daniel tried to keep the conversation moving by asking about one of his father's recent projects. His father spoke for a few minutes about a potential partnership with another company. The topic quickly became complicated, filled with numbers, strategies, and long-term investments. Daniel listened carefully, asking a few questions, clearly interested in the future of the business. I sat quietly beside him, nodding occasionally as if I didn't fully understand what they were discussing. Margaret watched me again during that conversation. She noticed that I wasn't participating and seemed to interpret my silence exactly the way she expected. To her, it probably confirmed the idea that I didn't belong in discussions about business or financial matters. After a few minutes, she let out a small sigh, like someone who had been thinking about something for a while and finally decided to say it. "Daniel," she said calmly, turning toward her son, "I assume this relationship is temporary." The words fell into the room like a sudden weight. The quiet sound of silverware stopped immediately. Daniel looked at his mother in shock, clearly not expecting her to say something so direct. "Mom," he said, frowning, "what are you talking about?" Margaret kept her voice smooth and controlled, but the meaning behind it was obvious. She folded her hands lightly on the table and looked at him with the calm confidence of someone who believed she was simply stating a fact. "Well," she continued, "you're both young. Relationships at this stage of life don't always last." Daniel glanced at me quickly, probably worried about how I would react. I lowered my eyes and gave a small, polite smile, as if I wasn't offended at all. Inside, however, I was paying close attention to every word. Margaret continued speaking, her tone still polite, but now carrying a quiet sense of superiority. A woman from such humble circumstances might struggle to fit into our world. Daniel's expression hardened immediately. "That's not fair," he said, but she didn't stop. "I'm not trying to be unkind," she replied. "I'm simply being realistic." Daniel's father finally spoke, leaning forward slightly in his chair. His voice sounded calmer than Margaret's, but the message behind it was almost the same. "You seem like a sweet girl," he said to me, looking directly across the table. "But Daniel has certain responsibilities. Our family business requires someone more suitable by his side." The way he said it made the meaning clear. Someone with the right background. Someone with the right education. Someone from the right kind of family. Margaret nodded in agreement. "Exactly," she said. "Perhaps someone with stronger connections. Someone who understands the expectations of a family like ours." Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat and rubbed his forehead slightly, clearly frustrated by the direction the conversation had taken. I could see that he hadn't expected his parents to speak so openly in front of me. I kept my voice gentle and calm when I responded. "Of course," I said quietly. Daniel looked at me in surprise. "You're okay with that?" he asked. I gave him a small, understanding smile. "I understand," I said softly. That response seemed to reassure Margaret immediately. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and her expression softened in a strange way, like she believed I had accepted my place in the situation. To her, my quiet agreement probably confirmed every assumption she had already made about me. Daniel looked confused. He probably expected me to argue or defend myself, but instead I remained calm and polite. That only made the situation more awkward for him. Margaret glanced at her husband again before speaking once more. "You must realize," she said gently, "that Daniel's future will involve many responsibilities. Business events, social obligations, important connections. It requires someone who is comfortable in that environment." I nodded slowly, pretending to agree with her reasoning. "Yes," I said quietly. "That makes sense." Daniel looked even more frustrated now. "Mom, can we not do this tonight?" he said. But Margaret had already decided to continue. She had become so confident in her judgment that she no longer felt the need to hold back her opinion. She sighed slightly and leaned back again, her voice taking on a tone that sounded almost sympathetic. "Honestly, Daniel," she said, "this girl probably doesn't even understand what real wealth or business looks like." The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Daniel looked down at the table, clearly embarrassed. His father remained silent, watching carefully to see how I would react. Margaret seemed completely certain that her comment was accurate. I slowly set my fork down on the plate. The small sound of metal touching porcelain echoed softly across the quiet table. Until that moment, I had kept my eyes lowered most of the evening, acting shy and uncertain. But now I lifted my head and looked directly at Margaret for the first time with a calm, steady expression. The room suddenly felt very still. For the first time that night, I wasn't pretending to be unsure anymore. My posture straightened slightly as I met her gaze. Margaret noticed the change immediately. Her confident expression flickered for just a moment, like she had sensed something unexpected. Daniel's father also leaned forward slightly, watching me more carefully now. I kept my voice calm when I spoke. "Actually," I said slowly, my tone steady and clear, "I understand it very well." The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere around the table shifted. Just a few seconds earlier, Margaret had been completely confident in her judgment. She believed she had already defined exactly who I was. But when I looked directly at her and spoke with a calm, steady voice, that certainty began to crack. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly as she studied my face again, this time with more curiosity than before. Daniel also noticed the change. he turned toward me slowly, his expression confused. The girl sitting beside him no longer looked shy or uncertain. My posture had straightened, and the hesitation I had shown earlier had disappeared completely. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I calmly reached into my small bag and pulled out my phone. The movement was slow and deliberate. Across the table, Daniel's father watched closely, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he sensed that something important was about to happen. The room had become completely silent. Even Margaret, who had been speaking so confidently just moments earlier, was now watching me with cautious attention. I unlocked my phone and opened an email that had arrived earlier that afternoon. Then I turned the screen toward Daniel's father. "Perhaps this will explain," I said calmly. At first he looked confused, but the moment his eyes focused on the message displayed on the screen, his entire expression changed. The calm confidence he had carried all evening vanished almost instantly. His eyes widened, and his hand froze in the air for a moment before slowly lowering to the table. "How did you get this?" he asked. His voice sounded completely different now. The authority he had earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Because my company sent it?" I replied. Margaret frowned immediately. She leaned forward, trying to see the phone screen more clearly, but Daniel's father was already staring at it with intense concentration. The message was short, but the meaning behind it was impossible to misunderstand. It was a formal notification about an ongoing negotiation, one involving the possible acquisition of his company. Daniel looked from his father to me, completely confused.
Wait, what?
He said. I placed the phone gently on the table so everyone could see it. "I suppose this is the part where things become a little clearer," I said calmly. Margaret's polite smile had completely disappeared now. Her eyes moved between me and the phone, trying to understand what was happening. "I'm the majority shareholder of the investment firm currently negotiating to acquire your company," I explained. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched across the room like a thick fog. Daniel stared at me as if he had never seen me before. Margaret's face slowly lost its color, and Daniel's father leaned back in his chair, still processing what he had just heard. "You what?" Daniel finally managed to say. His voice sounded almost stunned. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "The firm handling the acquisition discussions with your father's company is partially owned by several investors," I continued, "but I hold the largest share." Daniel's father cleared his throat quietly, still staring at the phone. "That's impossible," he muttered. "It's not," I replied gently. Margaret's eyes widened as the realization slowly began to settle in. She looked back at me again, but this time there was no judgment in her expression. Instead, there was confusion, shock, and something else: uneasiness. "But you said your mother runs a small shop?" she said. I nodded calmly. "She does." Daniel's father lifted his head slowly. "You made it sound like it was a tiny neighborhood store." I gave a small, polite smile. "It is a shop," I said, "but it's also part of a national retail chain that my family built over the last 20 years. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The quiet girl they had been questioning all evening no longer looked like someone uncertain about the world of business or wealth. The tone of my voice was calm and confident, and the way I spoke made it clear that everything I had said earlier had been carefully chosen. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to understand what had just happened. "So all of that earlier," he said slowly. I nodded slightly. "Yes." Margaret looked at her husband again, her expression filled with disbelief. They had spent the entire dinner judging me, assuming that I had no understanding of the kind of world they lived in. They believed I was someone who would never belong in their social circle. And now they were realizing that the person they had quietly dismissed might soon hold a position of power over their company's future. Daniel's father straightened his posture again, trying to recover some of his earlier composure. "You deliberately misled us," he said carefully. "I answered every question truthfully," I replied. Margaret shook her head slowly, clearly overwhelmed. "But you acted like you didn't understand anything about business." I shrugged lightly. "You seemed very confident about your assumptions," I said. Daniel looked between all of us, still struggling to process the situation. "You're telling me that the girl I've been dating for 8 months," he began, "is one of the investors negotiating with your father's company?" I finished calmly. Margaret suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Her earlier confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by visible tension. The same woman who had been politely criticizing me just minutes earlier now seemed unsure of what to say. Daniel's father finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "We should discuss the acquisition tomorrow," he said slowly. I nodded once. That would be appropriate. The power in the room had shifted completely. The assumptions that had guided the entire evening had collapsed, leaving Daniel's parents facing a reality they had never expected when the dinner began. Margaret looked at me again, her expression no longer confident or dismissive, but uncertain and cautious as she began to understand that the quiet girl she had underestimated all night was someone whose decisions could soon affect the future of their company and the world they believed they controlled. For several seconds after the revelation, no one at the table seemed able to speak. The room that had once felt filled with quiet confidence from Daniel's parents now felt heavy with disbelief. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her hands resting on the edge of the table, as if she was still trying to understand what had just happened. Daniel's father stared at the phone for a moment longer before slowly pushing it back toward me. His expression had completely changed. The calm authority he had shown earlier in the evening had been replaced by careful caution. Daniel looked at me as if he had suddenly discovered a completely different person sitting beside him. His eyes searched my face, trying to connect the girl he had known for months with the person who had just revealed something so unexpected. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked quietly. There was no anger in his voice, only confusion. I turned slightly toward him, meeting his gaze honestly. "Because I wanted to know if you liked me or my success." He blinked slowly, clearly not expecting that answer. "For the past 8 months," I continued calmly, "you only knew one version of me. A girl with a normal job, a small apartment, and a quiet life. You never treated me differently because of money or status, and I appreciated that." Daniel looked down at the table for a moment, thinking about everything I had just said. Then I shifted my attention to his parents. "And tonight," I added, "I wanted to see how your family treats people they believe are beneath them." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her earlier confidence had completely vanished. The same woman who had once looked at me with polite judgment now seemed unsure how to respond. "Oh, my dear," she said suddenly, forcing a smile that looked much less natural than the ones she had worn earlier. "I believe this has all been a misunderstanding." Her tone had changed dramatically. It was softer now, almost overly friendly. Daniel's father cleared his throat quietly beside her, clearly aware of the awkward situation developing at the table. "I'm sure Margaret didn't intend to sound harsh," he added carefully. I raised my hand slightly in a polite gesture, stopping them before they could continue. No, I said gently. It wasn't a misunderstanding. The room fell quiet again. I heard every word clearly. I continued, keeping my tone calm. And honestly, I'm glad you said them. Margaret's forced smile faded slowly. You are very protective of your son, I said to her. I understand that. But the way people treat others when they believe those people have nothing tells you a lot about their character. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair again, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between us. He had probably never seen his parents placed in a position like this before. His father leaned forward slightly, trying to regain control of the situation. We should focus on the business discussion tomorrow, he said. This evening doesn't need to affect professional matters. I nodded once. Of course, I replied calmly. Business is business. The conversation about the company ended there, but the emotional weight of the evening still lingered in the room. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. The quiet sound of the chair moving across the floor seemed louder than usual in the tense silence. I should probably head home, I said politely. Daniel stood up immediately as well. I'll walk you out. Neither of his parents stopped us. They remained seated at the table, both deep in thought as they tried to process everything that had happened. Daniel and I walked through the large hallway together toward the front door. The marble floor reflected the soft lights above us as we moved. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. When we reached the door, Daniel finally turned to face me. I feel like I don't know you anymore, he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry. It sounded more like someone trying to understand a complicated puzzle. I smiled slightly. You know the real me now, I said. He studied my face carefully. Are we okay? He asked. It was an honest question. After everything that had happened during the dinner, he clearly wasn't sure where we stood anymore. I paused for a moment before answering. The evening had revealed a lot about his parents, but Daniel himself had reacted very differently. He had been uncomfortable with their comments from the beginning and had tried to defend me even before he knew the truth. That depends, I said calmly. Daniel looked confused again. Depends on what? I stepped closer to the door and picked up my coat from the stand beside it. Next time we meet, I continued, turning back toward him with a small smile. You're coming to dinner with my parents. He blinked in surprise. Your parents? Wes. He laughed nervously, still trying to process everything. After tonight, I'm a little nervous about that idea. I opened the door slowly, letting the cool night air enter the hallway. Don't worry, I said gently. Then I added one final sentence that made his eyes widen again. Their house makes this one look small. And that was the moment everything changed. A dinner that started with judgment, quiet insults, and assumptions ended with a truth no one at that table expected. Sometimes people reveal their real character not when they meet someone powerful, but when they believe the person in front of them has nothing. This story isn't just about wealth or revenge. It's about respect, humility, and the danger of underestimating someone based on appearances. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more shocking revenge tales like this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. And remember, the quietest person in the room might just be the one with the biggest secret.